In the dying light of a cold December afternoon, Whitehall Palace sits silent and brooding, its lofty arches and marble halls cloaked in shadow. A single harpsichord note drifts through the emptiness, each reverberation hanging in the frosty air like a whispered secret. Imagine yourself slipping through a heavy velvet curtain, the faint scent of burned tallow and aged oak filling your nostrils. Can you almost feel the chill beneath your cloak as you tread softly toward the Queen's private chambers? Tonight, we step inside this world of hushed urgency and regality to witness the final days of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen whose life was as brilliant and tempestuous as any legend. Elizabeth's court, usually alive with gilded gowns and exuberant laughter, feels more like a mausoleum. Flickering candlelight dances across walls hung with tapestry scenes of Tudor triumph. But there is no celebration here, only the steady, measured steps of ladies-in-waiting and the distant whispers of courtiers exchanging worried glances. At 70, an age few reach in this unforgiving era, Elizabeth's once imposing figure has grown frail. Her silken gowns hang looser, the vibrant reds and purples of her youth muted by time. And yet, there is a defiance in the set of her shoulders, a regal dignity that refuses to bend even as her strength wanes. In these first unsettling moments, you will learn how the Queen's routine morning ritual took a sinister turn. The very powder she dusted onto her alabaster face, meant to convey ageless perfection, may have become her undoing. Lead-based cosmetics, fashionable at court, clung to her skin in thick layers, sealing in every pore. With each breath, she inhaled invisible particles that settled deep within her body. Could a queen's vanity truly harbour a deadly secret? Behind the gilded doors of her bedchamber, Elizabeth began to show signs of alarming fatigue. She once greeted each dawn with youthful vigour, transcribing state papers by lamplight, receiving foreign ambassadors, and strolling in the palace gardens. But on that fateful winter morning, she dozed at the council table, her quill slipping from a trembling hand. Those close to her noted a pallor by turns ghostly and grey, as though life itself had abdicated her complexion. It was not merely age, they whispered. Something more insidious was at work. Yet physical decline was not the only enemy at the gates. In the hush of candlelit corridors, rumours swirled like drifting embers. Some courtiers spoke of the death, distemper, believing her mind to be fraying under the weight of regret and grief. Others conjured visions of slow-acting poison, weaving dark theories that rivaled the most scandalous pages of her annals. Through feverish nights, Elizabeth shunned physicians' potions, spurning their herbal tonics as mere distractions from her true duties. What could any healer offer a monarch whose spirit seemed already beyond reach? Throughout these long, uncertain nights, Elizabeth wrestled with memories that refused to rest. The absence of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, whose youthful rebellion once stirred her heart, echoed painfully in the hollows of her thoughts. Their fraught relationship, equal parts devotion and betrayal, played out once more in her mind's theatre, and every recollection brought a fresh pang of sorrow. Was it grief, some wondered, that hastened her demise? How much of her anguish was self-inflicted, and how much stemmed from the burdens of sovereignty? And yet, even as the Queen's candle guttered low, she remained ever mindful of England's future. Behind closed doors, she convened a series of clandestine councils to unravel the knot of succession. The Scottish king, James VI, loomed as her heir, a man she had never fully trusted. In these secret gatherings, Elizabeth weighed every possible outcome, aware that her decisions would shape the kingdom for generations to come. Could she summon the clarity and courage to name a successor without igniting fresh conflict? Soon the palace corridors would ring with the tolling of bells announcing her passing. But before that final solemn hour arrived, Elizabeth clung to dignity and decorum. She issued her last directives, the arrangement of her funeral procession, the crafting of her epitaph, the memorial that would burn in the hearts of her subjects. And when at last the end came, it was as discreet as her reign. No public spectacle, no grand flourish, just a quiet surrender of life that left a nation gasping in collective grief. As you linger in this moment, consider the fragility of power and the relentless passage of time. A queen so revered, so feared, and so beloved now, lay at the mercy of forces she once commanded. Tomorrow, we will trace the marks of her decline. Those first shivers of fever, the sudden weakness in her step, the pale reflection in the mirror, and discover how they set into motion a drama of politics, medicine, and human vulnerability. But for now, let the hush of Whitehall remind you that even the greatest among us must eventually face an ending. And so, with the last candle's flame flickering low, we step forward into Elizabeth's world one more time, as her final chapter unfolds. Stepping out from the hush of the opening scene, we find ourselves in the heart of a bitterly cold January, morning in 1602. A thin veil of frost clings to the leaded windows of the Privy Council chamber, painting spidery patterns on the glass. Courtiers in heavy cloaks tread warily over stone floors, their breath steaming in the frigid air. At the head of the long oak table sits Elizabeth I, once famed for her fiery presence and impenetrable poise. Today, however, something about her demeanor feels off, and those closest to her can't help but notice. On that fateful morning, the Queen arrives later than usual, her customary brisk stride replaced by hesitant steps. She greets her advisors with a polite but distant nod, avoiding the warm flicker of the brazier at the chamber's centre. As the meeting begins, Thomas Egerton, the Lord Chancellor, clears his throat and dares a concerned glance toward her. His normally crisp retorts falter as he describes the latest vineyard dispute. Elizabeth lifts her hand, her fingers trembling ever so slightly, and signals for silence. She attempts to lift her quill, but the feather slips from her grasp, scattering, drops of ink across the parchment. Whispers ripple through the assembled courtiers. Some attribute the slip to an unseasonal chill seeping through the stone walls. Others recall the whispers in the cloisters that speak of the vice in her veins. Amid these murmurs, Elizabeth maintains her composure, but only just. A flicker of worry crosses her face as she attempts to steady her hand around a warmed cup of spiced wine. She sips, then pauses, her lips tightening around the rim as though sensing that life itself has grown suddenly bitter. In the days that follow, servants note subtle but unmistakable changes. Before dawn, on January 17th, the Queen's Chamberlain reports that Elizabeth lingered over her morning toilette. Normally, the process of donning her ornate gowns and coifs is swift and exacting, every ruffle and pearl in its precise place. Now, she seems to falter over the glint of a jewel, hesitating as if dazzled. Her hairpins slip, and she brushes them aside with an uncharacteristic sigh. A lady-in-waiting ventures a gentle question. "Your Majesty, shall I fetch your apothecary's cordial?" And Elizabeth responds with a soft, "Not yet." By the 18th, her herald, William Trumbull, observes that the Queen's speech carries a strange rasp, as though her throat has grown raw overnight. When she addresses matters of state, her tone wavers between regal command and fragile uncertainty. She pauses mid-sentence, then corrects herself with a thin, wry smile, as though embarrassed by a momentary lapse. Those in attendance exchange alarmed glances. The mind so celebrated for its sharp wit now seems to hesitate before each utterance. At breakfast on the 19th, a modest repast of pottage and lightly buttered bread, Elizabeth seems uninterested in her usual ritual of savouring each bite. She pushes the bowl aside after a few spoonfuls, pressing a perfumed handkerchief to her lips. A courtesan nearby coughs discreetly into her sleeve, so discreetly that only the Queen notices. Elizabeth's eyes narrow, a flash of irritation crossing her pale features. "We have matters graver than coughs and colds," she murmurs, her voice brittle. Yet the handkerchief remains in place long after the cough has faded. By the 20th, the Queen's gait has lost its confident rhythm. A routine inspection of the royal stables, which once had her riding a spirited mare through morning mist, is trimmed to a brief visit. Instead of vaulting into the saddle, Elizabeth accepts an embroidered cushion placed upon a wooden chair, where she sits shivering despite the fur-lined cloak around her shoulders. She nods politely to the stable hands but rarely speaks, her hand drumming an uneasy rhythm on the armrest. Court physicians are summoned on the 21st. Dr. Edward Brown arrives at Whitehall with a leather satchel full of remedies, cordials, distilled from lavender, catnip and cinnamon, and small phials of amber-hued elixir, promising restoration of humours. He bows deeply and addresses the Queen. With gracious reserve, Elizabeth consents to having her pulse taken. His fingers press gently against her wrist. Her pulse is weak and erratic, feeble as a child's. Brown frowns, murmuring to his assistant, in Latin. He prescribes a gentle bloodletting, 2 ounces drawn from her left arm, and a course of warming poultices for her chest. That afternoon, in her private solar, Elizabeth reclines on a canopy bed draped with crimson velvet. A fire crackles in the hearth, sending golden light dancing across tapestries. Brown's poultices, linen cloths soaked in bowls of hot herbs, are applied to her sternum. The Queen's breathing deepens, and for a moment her eyes close in relief. The courtiers breathe easier, believing the worst may yet be staved off. But as evening descends, Elizabeth's attendants note beads of perspiration forming on her forehead. By candlelight, her skin looks translucent, as though the light passes through her like mist. The next morning brings fresh concern. Elizabeth awakens before dawn, her thin frame shivering under layers of eiderdown. She summons her secretary, Robert Cecil, and dictates a letter to King James, instructing him on matters of succession. Her voice is softer, yet resolute, each word chosen as though it were a precious gemstone. After the letter is sealed, Elizabeth's strength fades rapidly. She drifts back onto her pillows, her eyes fixed on the ceiling beams where painted cherubs gaze down. In that moment, she seems fragile as the porcelain figurines that decorate her dressing table. Over the subsequent days, her cough deepens, echoing through the stillness of her chambers. Nurses place bowls of broth and cups of warm wine by her bedside, but she eats little, claiming that food tastes of ash and memory. The Queen's beauty, her alabaster skin and auburn hair, begins to look strangely gaunt. Courtiers murmur about the White Empress in hushed tones, recalling portraits where her complexion was once luminous and unblemished. Amidst the growing fear, Elizabeth's spirit flickers defiantly. On the 25th, she insists on standing, for her evening devotions, clutching a small prayer book bound in velvet. She recites psalms in a clear voice, pausing only to cough. When the final amen echoes through the chapel, she leans heavily on her attendants, her resolve waning but unbroken. Even in frailty, she refuses complete surrender, clinging to the rituals that defined her reign. By the end of the month, it is undeniable, the Queen is gravely ill. The same powder that once symbolized her immortal beauty may have turned against her. The harsh winter chill may have masked a deeper affliction, and grief over past losses may have eroded her resilience. In these first tremors of decline, all the forces, vanity, politics, and the sheer burden of power converge on a single figure, leaving Elizabeth I vulnerable for the first time in her storied life. Tomorrow, as the firelight dims further and the candles burn lower, we will examine how the court's whispers transformed into full-blown rumours of poisoning and madness. But for now, we bear witness to the Queen's first faltering steps toward her final journey, when the mightiest monarch in Europe confronted the immutable laws of mortality. A week after that first tremor of frailty, the chill in Whitehall seemed to settle into Elizabeth's very bones. Each morning, the Queen awoke to a body that felt foreign, limbs heavy as if weighed down by lead, joints stiff with an ache that no poultice could soothe. Her once fluid movements now carried the hesitance of a person who feared the simple act of standing might betray her. On the morning of January 28th, servants found her seated on the edge of her canopied bed, long after dawn's first light. A single shaft of pale sunlight slanted through the narrow window, illuminating motes of dust that danced like fireflies in the dim chamber. Elizabeth's face was drawn, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion, yet her expression remained defiantly composed. When a lady-in-waiting knelt to assist her into a dressing gown of pale green satin, the Queen allowed the fabric to slip across her shoulders, but her fingers fumbled at the fastenings. With a soft sigh, she murmured, "A pity. Even the simplest task demands all my strength." By midday, the council chamber felt colder than any winter morning. Elizabeth took her seat beneath the painted heraldry, but she leaned forward slightly, pressing both hands to her knees as though bracing against a sudden gale. Her favourite velvet cushion, once plump to perfection, now appeared to kneel beneath her weight. Courtiers watched in hushed wonder as her breath came in shallow gasps, each exhalation misting the air in small, visible clouds. At a gesture from her chamberlain, a brazier was lit low at her feet, sending a faint warmth upward, but it barely penetrated the oppressive chill that clung to her frame. The Queen's speech that afternoon was punctuated by unexpected pauses. As Sir Robert Carey reported on the issue of Scottish succession funds, Elizabeth's sharp intellect flickered for a moment. The carefully honed wit and rhetorical flourish that once came so effortlessly now required deliberate summoning. She paused mid-sentence, her gaze drifting to the high-vaulted ceiling adorned with painted angels. With a soft, retracting breath, she regained her bearing and continued. But murmurs rippled through the chamber. Was the mind so renowned beginning to falter under the weight of her suffering? Late that evening, Elizabeth retreated to her private, solar, a room warmed by a roaring fire and lined with tapestries depicting her victories. Yet the warmth seemed insufficient to thaw the chill in her chest. She sank onto a cushioned bench, drawing the velvet curtains tight against the night. A small table beside her held a silver vessel of spiced wine, intended to soothe her nerves and nourish her failing appetite. She raised the cup with a steady hand, but when she tasted the fiery heat on her tongue, her brow furrowed. "Too hot, and yet not enough," she whispered, as though weighing the paradox in each sip. The cup slipped from her grasp and clattered against the hardwood floor, sending droplets of crimson-tinged liquid across the polished surface. In the small hours of the next morning, the Queen's slumber was restless. She dreamt of her youth, the jubilant roar of the crowd at Tilbury, the pageantry of her coronation, the music of her private chamber echoing off carved oak. Yet these memories turned swiftly somber. Her father's executioner's axe rising, Mary's prison cell closing in, Essex's false smile dissolving into betrayal. With each image came a physical shiver that woke her entirely, her heart pounding as though afraid to rest. On the 30th, whispers spread that Elizabeth had taken ill enough to cancel her planned council meeting. Instead of addressing state affairs in person, she summoned her advisors to the solar, the flickering firelight illuminating her drawn silhouette. There, in the softer glow, she managed a thin smile, but her voice was quieter, almost brittle. "My friends, let us continue our discussion here, for I find congregation near the hearth more tolerable than the cold formality of the chamber." The words carried the faint echo of her former humour, yet they veiled a deeper pain that none could ignore. Physicians, summoned once more, declared that Elizabeth's strength was ebbing dangerously. They pressed warm hands to her wrists, spoke in low Latin about feverish humours and stagnated bile. When they attempted a gentle bloodletting, Elizabeth nodded without protest, though her lips turned an alarming shade of white at the sight of her own blood. She permitted the extraction of 3 ounces, a measure meant to restore balance. Yet when the cloth was applied to staunch the flow, her pulse remained faint, as though barely a whisper against the surgeon's finger. That evening, as twilight seeped into every corner of the palace, the Queen sat upright in her bed, attended by her closest confidants. Draped in a gown of deepest crimson satin, chosen not for comfort, but for the symbolism of power and sacrifice, she gazed into the dancing flames before her. Each flicker seemed to remind her of the brilliant height from which she now fell. With a voice barely above a whisper, she confided, "I have weathered greater storms than this body can bear." A hush fell over the room as her ladies exchanged glances laden with sorrow. By February the 2nd, Elizabeth's cough, once occasional, grew persistent, a rattling echo from deep within her chest. Each paroxysm left her breathless and pale, her hand pressed reflexively to her throat. A nurse offered a spoonful of honey and lemon, but the Queen shook her head. "Save your cordial for another time," she said. "Tonight, I wish only for the quiet." Through the long night, Elizabeth's attendants watched as she drifted in and out of fevered dreams. They noted the glow of flush on her cheeks, the rapid flutter of her eyelids, and the occasional murmur of names: Essex, James, Brown, tumbling from parched lips. At dawn, they found her sitting by the window, gazing out at the grey sky. A single tear traced a clean line down her cheek. When one of them dared to ask if she would like water, Elizabeth's voice cracked. "Tell me, my friend, when a star must fall, does it fear the darkness that follows?" Before they could answer, she turned away, wrapping herself in the heavy brocade drapes as though to shield her heart from the pain of her own question. As that day wore on, courtiers spoke of the white sovereign, her skin now almost translucent, her hair, still tied with ribbons of silver, appearing almost ethereal. They whispered that power itself had become too heavy a burden, that the flame which had once burned so fiercely now flickered on the brink of extinguishment. And yet, even in her weakened state, Elizabeth maintained a spark of her legendary resolve. When news arrived of uprisings in Ireland, she summoned the courage to inquire, her voice hoarse but determined. "What threats linger beyond these walls that demand my attention still?" Her final act of defiance came when she insisted on dictating a message to her loyal subjects, words of assurance that the crown would not falter, that the spirit of England, emboldened by her reign, would endure. She paused over each phrase, fighting against a mind wearied by pain. When the quill scratched its final words upon the parchment, she closed her eyes and leaned back, the effort draining the last of her strength. In these moments of profound vulnerability, the Queen revealed the inseparable bond between her body and the vast machinery of state. Each ache, each faltering breath, became a collective experience for a nation that had grown to depend upon her unyielding will. And so, as the candles sputtered low and the hush of Whitehall grew heavier still, Elizabeth I confronted the ultimate test: the surrender of the physical form that had carried her through decades of triumph and turmoil. Tomorrow, we will explore how the whispers in these shadowed corridors transformed into full-blown rumors of conspiracy, how courtiers and commoners alike grappled with the possibility that the life of England's most storied monarch had been stolen by poison rather than claimed by nature. But for now, we bear witness to the Queen's most private struggle, a heroic mind encaged within a failing vessel, yet still determined to rule until her final breath. Whispers of a darker fate began to slither through Whitehall's corridors, as Elizabeth's fragile form drifted between moments of lucidity and languor. By the first week of February, courtiers no longer spoke of simple illness. They spoke of curses and conspiracies. Behind closed doors, hushed conversations speculated that the Queen's regal facade masked something far more sinister than a winter chill or the slow ravages of age. Some claimed that her makeup, those alabaster layers she relied on to project eternal youth, was itself a villain. Lead-based powders, concocted to create that signature pale glow, were said to seep into her skin with every brushstroke. As the mercury dropped, pores tightened and cracked, capturing particles that crushed her health from within. Servants swore they saw her nose and chin flecked with faint grey residue, like the ash from a dying hearth. It was said that when Elizabeth sat for her morning toilette, the hush of her chamber fell away beneath the soft scrape of a brush, and with each stroke, the Queen may have unknowingly embraced her own demise. Others bent toward darker fantasies, recounting tales of poisoned goblets and vengeful rivals. They spoke of court favourites who harboured old grudges, noblemen who had once been cast aside, their fortunes overturned by Elizabeth's capricious favour. Had one of them slipped a deadly tincture into her spiced wine, trading loyalty for lethal ambition? Servants claimed they saw one of her cupbearers, once a jovial lad, shivering in the corner of her chamber, hands stained with an oily residue that vanished when questioned. No evidence emerged, of course, but rumour thrived on the absence of proof. Medical theories fought for dominance alongside political intrigue. Dr. Edward Brown, called again and again to her bedside, grew increasingly anxious as he catalogued Elizabeth's symptoms: a persistent, rasping cough that rattled in her chest like a distant thunderstorm, tremors that shook her hands when she reached for her prayer book, and an unrelenting fatigue so deep it seemed to drain her very soul. He recorded her pulse as weak and irregular, her skin alternately flushed, then ghostly pale. In his leather-bound journal, he noted observations in Latin: anima vacillans, a spirit trembling on the brink, a phrase that courtiers later translated into gossip-laced English as the Queen's soul unsteady. By candlelight, in chambers scented with frankincense and rosemary, physicians offered conflicting remedies. Brown recommended a poultice of crushed onions and verbena, applied hot against her chest, to draw out the noxious humours. Another doctor, Dr. Gilbert Bannister, argued for the virtues of bloodletting and cupping on her back, claiming that stagnated blood was the root of her decline. Elizabeth, possessed of her customary dignity, submitted only grudgingly, allowing the lancet to break her skin, but rejecting cups unless pressed by her most trusted ladies. She believed that to surrender completely to their ministrations was to admit defeat, and so she clung to the rituals of her reign even as her body rebelled. These conflicting treatments only fueled the palace gossip. Did the Queen secretly despise the physician's potions, believing them to be more poison than cure? A chambermaid recounted how Elizabeth, on a rare moment of candour, murmured that she felt as though my own breath conspires against me, as though life itself had turned traitor. Those words, carried like smuggled letters from servant to footman, ignited fresh speculation. If the Queen feared her very breath, what hope remained for the realm she had so steadfastly ruled? Elsewhere, learned courtiers consulted alchemists and astrologers in a desperate bid for answers. An early morning séance in a hidden corner of the palace summoned the spirits of past monarchs, Mary Tudor, her own sister, and even Henry VIII himself, to reveal the cause of Elizabeth's suffering. These gatherings were kept secret, yet details slipped out. The astrologer's trembling voice, the glow of a crystal sphere, a frantic scribble on parchment predicting the Queen's end if the stars did not shift. Such occult interventions spoke to the depth of dread that shadowed even the highest echelons of power. In parallel, political adversaries seized upon the uncertainty. Foreign ambassadors, once eager to curry favour, now tiptoed through state business, careful not to offend a monarch who might soon be unavailable. The French envoy wrote in a cabled dispatch that the palace atmosphere had become one of mourning without a body, and that courtiers moved like spectres, eyes cast downward. Meanwhile, the Spanish ambassador murmured to his king that Elizabeth's faltering health had transformed England from a formidable adversary into a dangerously unstable partner. Amid this swirl of fear and intrigue, the Queen herself remained outwardly composed. She continued to receive petitions, sign charters, and oversee affairs of state, veiling her weakness under a mask of measured calm. On February 5th, she granted an audience to the Privy Council, her hand steady as she pressed the royal seal into wax. Yet those present later recalled her voice as faint, her words clipped. She lingered over each syllable, as though gathering the will to speak. When the session ended, she rose slowly, pale as a ghost, beneath her ermine-trimmed cloak, and walked away without a backward glance. That evening, in her private oratory, Elizabeth lit a single candle and knelt before a silver crucifix. In a low voice, she recited prayers for deliverance and perhaps forgiveness. She paused, placed a pale hand to her temple, and closed her eyes against the ache within. If the rumors were true, if the poisons had taken hold, her faith now served as her final shield. Outside, the palace walls seemed to exhale a collective sigh, as though the very stones feared what fate held for the realm. As these rumors and medical mystifications intertwined, they set the stage for the most dramatic moments yet to come. The Queen's famous confrontation with the grim reality of her mortality and the fateful decisions she would make in the shadow of death. Next, we'll look closer at the political maneuvering and personal reflections that defined Elizabeth's succession plans, and the ultimate gamble she placed on naming James of Scotland as her heir. By early February, Elizabeth's illness had shifted from a private burden to a matter of state significance. In the silent corridors of Whitehall, whispers of her frailty mingled with the clatter of quills and the rustle of secret dispatches. Behind richly embroidered tapestries, courtiers spoke of politics and power with a new urgency. The question on every lip was no longer, will the Queen recover? But rather, who will succeed her? Elizabeth, for her part, never wavered in protocol. On the afternoon of February 6th, she summoned her most trusted advisers to the Privy Chamber. The air was chill, yet the tension felt colder still. Robert, Cecil, her Secretary of State and closest confidant, knelt before her. In one hand, she held a sheaf of papers bound with crimson ribbon. In the other, an ornate quill tipped in gold. With a measured calm, she instructed Cecil to read aloud her thoughts on succession. Her voice, though husky from fever, resonated with authority. "I have ruled this realm with steadfast purpose for many years," she began. "Yet the hour draws near when I must look beyond my own days, toward the future of England. Let no man doubt my intention. I appoint as my successor James Stuart, King of Scotland, that our two crowns may unite and peace be preserved." A murmur swept through the chamber. To some, James VI was a distant and uneasy choice. His claims to the English throne fraught with religious and cultural tensions. Catholics whispered that he might restore papal influence. Puritans feared he would tolerate too many rituals. But Elizabeth, ever the shrewd stateswoman, had weighed these risks against the chaos that might follow her death without a clear heir. In naming James, she sought to bind Scotland and England under a single line, averting civil war. Yet behind this political calculus lay a deeply personal undercurrent, the ghost of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. More than 3 decades earlier, Essex had risen from favoured courtier to traitorous rebel, only to meet the executioner's block for his audacity. Elizabeth had pardoned him once, then driven him away with a scornful reprimand. In the aftermath, she mourned both his betrayal and the loss of youthful passion. His memory haunted her, a reminder that even the fiercest loyalty could turn to mortal danger. As Cecil finished reading, Elizabeth's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She glanced at the empty chair where Essex himself might once have sat, a swirl of auburn hair and boundless ambition. "Let no shade of doubt fall upon my judgment," she said softly. "I have learned, through heartache and sorrow, that love and power are not always allies. May this choice spare England from the pain of divided hearts and broken allegiances." Outside the Privy Chamber, word spread like wildfire. Courtiers hurried through galleries, clutching hand-copied notes, debating in hushed urgency. The Spanish ambassador penned a terse report to King Philip, observing that Elizabeth's mention of Essex had rekindled old wounds, but that her resolve remained unshaken. In the French court, envoys deliberated whether to press their own claims, even as they steeled themselves for the arrival of James's agents in London. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's personal grief surfaced in quiet moments. In the sanctuary of her private oratory, she would kneel before a silver crucifix, fingering a single strand of Essex's hair, kept in a locket since his disgrace. she whispered prayers both for his soul and for her own, torn between remorse and a sense of duty. "Forgive me, my dearest friend," she murmured one candle-lit night. "You loved me with a heart that outshone my crown, and I repaid you with my crown's cold demands." This tension between duty and desire found expression in her correspondence. On February 8th, Elizabeth drafted a letter to Sir Walter Raleigh, another former favourite, whose star had risen and fallen in equal measure. She praised his service, urged him to safeguard the realm, and reminded him that loyalty, once relinquished, is hardest to reclaim. Raleigh, reading by the flicker of a single lamp, noted the Queen's anxious handwriting and the tremor in each stroke of the quill. He folded the letter carefully, understanding that these lines carried more weight than any royal decree. As her strength ebbed further, Elizabeth also faced pressure from religious factions. Anglican bishops implored her to reaffirm the Church of England's supremacy before naming a successor whose faith remained uncertain. Puritan leaders demanded assurances that James would maintain the reforms she had championed, and Catholic sympathizers circulated rumors that she might yet reverse course, naming a Catholic heir at the last moment. Elizabeth, weary of contention, refused to be swayed. With a quiet but firm hand, she sealed her letters, ensuring that her will, her final legacy, could not be undone. In the days that followed, the Queen's energy flagged noticeably. On February 10th, she lunched briefly in her solar, accepting only a cup of thick broth. Yet when a delegation of foreign dignitaries arrived to congratulate James on his impending accession, Elizabeth rose to meet them. Regal in a gown of forest green brocade, with a nod of acknowledgement, she declared, "Let my death bring unity, not sorrow. Let our two nations stand as one." Her words, uttered with struggle yet conviction, resonated through the hall, silencing all debate. That evening, alone in her bedchamber, Elizabeth gazed into a polished mirror framed with ivory. The woman who stared back bore the marks of triumph and trial, the fine lines etched by decades of laughter and command, the pallor of illness, the steadfast eyes that had faced down foreign armies and domestic rebellions. She lifted her hand to touch the reflection, as though bidding farewell to the ruler she had become. A single tear escaped, trailing down the bridge of her nose. "May history judge me kindly," she whispered. As the candle burned low, Elizabeth penned one final note, to her people rather than her courtiers, a message of gratitude and hope. She spoke of England's resilience, of the gardens and ships and scholars she had nurtured, and of the bright future she envisioned under new leadership. When she placed the parchment in a sealed box, her hand shook so fiercely that the scribbled words wavered as if alive. By mid-February, the Queen's condition had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer attend council meetings. Yet her influence loomed larger than ever. In every policy debate, every marriage proposal, every royal portrait commissioned in Londonderry or Bristol, Elizabeth's name shone as a guiding star. Even in absence, she shaped the destiny of the realm she had governed with unparalleled skill. And so, as we leave this chapter of political intrigue and personal reckoning, we glimpse the paradox at the heart of Elizabeth's final days. A sovereign who surrendered her life even as she asserted her authority with unyielding clarity. Tomorrow, we will turn from these hushed chambers to the solemn rituals that followed her passing, the funeral rites, the public mourning, and the enduring legacy of England's Virgin Queen. Soft banners of royal purple fluttered along the streets of London as sunlight filtered through a pale February sky, casting a muted glow on the throngs that gathered to pay their last respects. In the hush before dawn, torchbearers took their places, and trumpeters raised their instruments to the chill air. Somewhere, a muffled note of mourning drifted from a distant chapel, mingling with the soft clip-clop of horses' hooves. The day had finally come to bid farewell to Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose life had shaped the destiny of a nation. A single carriage, its wheels cushioned by black velvet, carried the Queen's coffin, an austere chest of oak banded with iron, through the city gates. The figure atop the bier was draped in a mantle of rich cloth of gold, the intricate embroidery catching the light like shards of sun. Courtiers in heavy cloaks walked silent beside the carriage, their plumes and ermine collars a stark contrast to the sorrow etched on their faces. Each step seemed to echo across time, the steady beat of drums marking the passage of an era. Crowds lined the thoroughfares, their breath visible in little clouds as they pressed forward, hoping to glimpse the sovereign who had ruled for 45 years. Men doffed their hats and cast low bows. Women clutched scarves to their hearts and whispered prayers beneath knitted brows. Even the poorest labourer paused in his work, eyes momentarily lifted from plough or anvil, as though the very act of building or tilling had been consecrated by her loss. Carols once sung in festive halls now emerged as dirges, slow, reverent melodies that drifted through marketplace and alley alike. As the procession wound its way past Westminster Abbey, a hush fell heavy enough to still the wind. Candles flickered in every stained glass window, their soft glow illuminating carved stone faces of angels and saints. Inside, the abbey's lofty nave was transformed into a cathedral of mourning. Pulpits draped in sable cloth stood against pillars wrapped in black crepe. At the high altar, bishops vested in their finest cope waited, their breath a ghostly mist in the dawn chill. When the doors opened and the cortege filed in, a single toll of the great bell pealed out, one for each decade of her reign. The funeral service itself was a blend of ritual and raw devotion. Scripture readings, Psalm 90 and the words of Ecclesiastes, echoed through the cavernous space, reminding the congregation that all flesh is as grass, and that the spirit returneth unto God who gave it. A choir of choristers, voices layered like woven silk, lifted a plaintive anthem. Mourn, ye heavens, and thou earth, to her return lament. Their harmonies carried through arch and aisle, stirring tears even among the most hardened courtier. Yet, it was in the personal tributes that the depth of grief revealed itself. Lady Catherine Howard stepped forward to place a single red rose atop the coffin, a symbol of love that transcended betrayal and time. Sir Walter Raleigh laid a folded scroll, its embossed seal bearing the Virgin Queen's cipher, upon the coffin lid, a testament to years of loyal service. Bishop Grindal, his face lined with sorrow, intoned a final blessing, his voice quavering as he prayed that Elizabeth's soul might find rest in that celestial realm she had long envisioned. Outside, the ceremony continued as the coffin was lowered into a vault beneath the altar. Earth was shoveled by attendants in silence, each handful a promise that her memory would not fade. When the last clod fell, a lament on the organ swelled into the rafters, a profound chord that seemed to linger in the air long after its echo had faded. Then, without fanfare, the congregation dispersed, some to weep in solitude, others to lay wreaths at the base of the abbey steps. Across England, bells tolled in cathedrals and parish churches alike, a nationwide chorus of mourning. In Cambridge, scholars paused their lectures to observe a moment of silence. In Bristol, shipwrights draped sails in black and lowered flags to half-mast. Even in distant colonies, the news travelled slowly but carried enormous weight, prompting solemn commemorations in far-flung outposts. The cultural shockwave was unmistakable. A monarch who had inspired playwrights and poets, commanded fleets and armies, and presided over an age of discovery was now gone. Yet, amid the sorrow, a sense of renewal stirred. Elizabeth's legacy would not be confined to marble tombs or faded portraits. She had championed the arts. Globe theatre companies paid tribute with performances of new masks that wove her virtues into mythic allegory. Painters captured her final likeness, not as the cold icon of earlier years, but with a soft luminescence around her features, an acknowledgement that even the greatest power must yield to mortality. Bookbinders stamped devotional texts with her crest, and silversmiths crafted memorial medallions inscribed with words borrowed from her own speeches. I die a queen, but yet I live. In private letters, nobles recounted what Elizabeth had meant to them. An ambassador in Paris wrote of the graceful dignity she had displayed even in her suffering. A Venetian merchant lamented the loss of a sovereign who had opened new channels of trade and tempered them with justice. More common voices, the tavern keeper who had once served her ale after a royal progress, the seamstress who stitched her gowns, remembered her generosity and quick wit, virtues that outlasted crowns and scepters. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of her reign was the chapel itself, now renamed the Chapel of the Virgin Queen. Pilgrims travelled from Ireland and Scotland to kneel at her tomb, leaving tokens of gratitude, strands of hair, embroidered kerchiefs, pressed flowers. They told tales of how Elizabeth's image had hung on their cottage walls, a beacon in uncertain times. For them, her death was not merely a historical event, but a personal loss, a reminder that leadership born of courage and compassion could shape a people's destiny. By late February, as London thawed under early spring rains, the atmosphere shifted from mourning to commemoration. Statues were commissioned, gardens planted in her memory, and charities established in her name to aid orphans and widows, echoes of her own concern for her subjects. The Privy Council issued proclamations celebrating her achievements, the defeat of the Armada, the expansion of the Navy, the flourishing of English drama and poetry. In every hall and hearth, the question was not only, how shall we grieve, but more importantly, how shall we honour her legacy? And so, as the last candle burned low in the abbey, and the faint scent of incense lingered like a benediction, Elizabeth's reign passed from living history into legend. The Virgin Queen was gone, but the tapestry she wove across decades remained, vibrant, threaded through the hearts of her people, immortalized in art and song, and etched into the very soul of a nation she had guided through storm and triumph. Tomorrow, in the quiet after the funeral's echo, we will explore how her successors built upon that foundation, forging an empire that would span continents and centuries, all on the bedrock of a queen's unwavering vision. A warm breeze stirs the leaves of a cacao tree as dawn breaks over the low hills of Mesoamerica, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. Imagine the first rays of sunlight filtering through broad, glossy foliage, alighting on pods the size of a man's forearm, their surfaces ribbed like ancient scrolls waiting for someone to decipher their secrets. Here, where the Maya and their predecessors walked centuries before Elizabeth I's reign, cacao was more than a humble bean. It was the sacred food of the gods, woven into the very fabric of ritual, economy, and power. Centuries ago, in the heart of what we now call southern Mexico and Guatemala, the earliest cultivators discovered that breaking open a ripe cacao pod revealed scores of glistening white seeds embedded in a sweet pulp. By fermenting those seeds, beneath banana leaves, they coaxed out complex flavors that mingled tartness with gentle bitterness, a taste so remarkable it became the centerpiece of offerings to deities in stone altars atop stepped pyramids. Priests would pour thick, frothy cacao drinks into carved vessels, anointing temple floors with liquid tribute. Can you picture the ceremony? The rhythmic drumming echoing through sandstone corridors, the faint scent of smoke rising from incense burners as masked worshippers chanted invocations, their voices rising and falling with the froth of each carefully ladled cup. For the Olmec, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, cacao, beans served as a form of currency long before coins clinked across European markets. A single bean could purchase a tamale, while 100 might secure a fine textile or a prized hoe. In bustling marketplaces, shaded by woven mats and timber posts, women in embroidered huipils bartered cacao for pottery, jade beads, and salt harvested from coastal flats. Children played nearby, rolling beans across smooth river stones in playful competitions, unknowingly learning the value of this sacred commodity. It was a marvel of nature that nutrition and divinity could reside in the same vessel, bound by the sticky pulp that nourished both body and spirit. As the Maya civilization blossomed between 250 and 900 CE, their affinity for cacao deepened. Hieroglyphs carved into limestone stelae depict noble figures and divine patrons clutching elegant ceramic beakers, the rims frosted with dark, frothy foam. In ball courts where warriors competed under the blistering sun, they quenched their thirst with spiced cacao elixirs, believing the drink conferred strength and courage. Priests documented these practices in codices, pre-Columbian books of bark paper, linking the drink to the maize god and the hero twins of sacred myth. Each sip of the velvety brew was a communion with ancestors, an affirmation of lineage, and a promise of renewal. The ritual significance of cacao extended into marriage and death alike. In wedding ceremonies, the groom served his bride a portion of chocolate, sweetened with honey and flavored with chili, to symbolize the union of their families and the bitterness and sweetness inherent in life. At funerary rites, cups of pure, unsweetened cacao were offered to guide the departed through the underworld, providing sustenance on the soul's perilous journey. These traditions underscored a profound belief that cacao was a bridge between the earthly realm and the divine, uniting the living and the dead in a sacred cycle. By the time the Aztec Empire asserted control over central Mexico in the 14th century, cacao had become the monopoly of the privileged few. Emperor Montezuma II, ruling from the golden halls of Tenochtitlan, is reputed to have consumed up to 50 goblets of zocoatl, a bitter chocolate drink, each day, flavored with ground vanilla, annatto, and a pinch of dried chili. His personal brew was so prized that it was delivered in precious vessels by palace servants, guarded jealously from the dust and distractions of court life. For the Aztecs, cacao was entwined with warfare as well. They paid soldiers in beans, rewarding victories with the promise of a storied banquet of chocolate and maize cakes. But the reach of cacao was not limited to palace intrigue and battlefield valor. In mountain villages and coastal hamlets, commoners harvested pods from wild-growing trees, trading their yield at city markets. Midwives used cacao paste mixed with medicinal herbs to soothe new mothers, while healers prescribed cacao infusions to calm fevers and aid digestion. In every corner of society, cacao wove a thread of continuity, a reminder that, from the humblest peasant to the loftiest ruler, all shared a connection to this miraculous fruit. The arrival of Spanish conquistadors in the early 16th century would transform cacao's destiny. Hernán Cortés, navigating the muddy waterways of Lake Texcoco in 1519, encountered the Aztec capital and the intoxicating aroma of roasted cacao beans. He marveled at the nobles' golden goblets filled with the frothy brew and recognized its potential for trade. Though he initially dismissed the flavor as acrid, he soon appreciated that adding cane sugar and cinnamon could render it more palatable to European tastes. Within years, Spanish elites in Seville and Madrid were sipping chocolate in gilded salons, cloaked in velvet and lace, their laughter mingling with the steam rising from porcelain cups. Back in Mesoamerica, the cultivation of cacao intensified. Spanish land grants, encomiendas, converted vast tracts of tropical forest into plantations, where indigenous laborers and imported African slaves toiled under the blistering sun. Cacao pods were harvested with long hooked poles, split open with machetes, and their seeds spread out in thatched huts to ferment for several days. After drying, the beans were toasted over open fires, winnowed to remove husks, and ground on heated metates into a thick paste. This paste was then mixed with sugar and spices and pounded into a paste or molded into early chocolate bars, a far cry from the ancient rituals, but nonetheless the genesis of a global industry. Even as European palates evolved, the memory of cacao's sacred origins persisted in distant whispers. Jesuit missionaries chronicled indigenous ceremonies in their letters home, lamenting the loss of pagan rites while inadvertently preserving crucial ethnographic details. In remote highland villages, the old ways endured. Villagers gathered at moonlit crossroads to share bitter cacao brews and speak the language of their ancestors, the foam atop each cup a fleeting echo of temple ceremonies long since abandoned. Today, when we break a single chocolate bar or watch the brown liquid swirl in our morning mug, we inherit this rich tapestry. Every silky sip carries the weight of millennia. the smoky hearth fires of Maya priests, the golden goblets of Aztec emperors, the thunderous ball game courts, and the whispered prayers of midwives. It reminds us that a simple bean can carry the divine and the mundane in perfect harmony. As we leave behind the jungle's green shadows and step into the sunlit plazas of colonial towns, we'll soon trace how chocolate's journey across the Atlantic reshaped economies, diets, and cultures on 2 continents. But for now, let the memory of those first hands husking fresh cacao pods under a rising sun linger with you, an invocation to savor not just the taste of chocolate, but its story, steeped in ritual, resilience, and reverence. In our next chapter, we'll cross oceans and centuries to witness chocolate's metamorphosis in the kitchens and factories of Europe, where artisans and inventors would forever alter the legacy of the food of the gods. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, the grand capital of the Aztec Empire, cacao was more than a mere luxury. It was a symbol of divine favor and imperial power. As dawn's first light filtered through the latticed windows of the royal palace, servants hurried to prepare the emperor's private chamber for his daily ritual, the ceremonial brewing of xochitl, the bitter water that would fortify Montezuma II for the burdens of sovereignty. Imagine the scene. A low hearth piled with glowing embers, copper cauldrons suspended above the flames, and baskets heaped with freshly harvested cacao pods. Palace attendants cracked open the fibrous shells with polished obsidian knives, revealing the glistening seeds within. These beans, carefully fermented under the watchful eyes of temple priests, were then toasted over the embers until their skins blistered and the cool aroma of roasted nuts mingled with the heady scent of copal resin burning on nearby altars. As the beans sizzled, a sacred hush descended upon the room. Priests chanted invocations to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity credited with gifting cacao to mankind, and sprinkled ground chilihua peppers onto the simmering brew. When the mixture was sufficiently aromatic, it was transferred to a hollowed gourd and whisked with a wooden molinillo until it foamed into a thick, ebony froth. To this, vanilla orchids and a pinch of annatto were added, spices harvested from distant realms to underscore the emperor's reach across Mesoamerica. By the time Montezuma awoke, the palace corridors reverberated with the low murmur of courtiers awaiting his arrival, draped in robes of jaguar-patterned cotton and adorned with quetzal feather plumes. The emperor entered the chamber with an air of ceremonial gravity. He seated himself on a low, ivory-backed throne, and a young noble presented the first cup of xochitl. Before sipping, Montezuma whispered a prayer of gratitude to the gods, a ritual he repeated each morning to acknowledge the cosmic balance between Earth's bounty and human stewardship. They say Montezuma consumed up to 50 goblets of this spiced chocolate daily, each vessel measured to ensure both potency and ritual purity. The drink was never sweetened. Sugar was unknown to the Aztecs. Instead, its sharp bitterness, tempered by peppers and vanilla, was thought to sharpen the mind and harden the spirit. Nobles believed that a morning cup of xochitl bestowed clarity of judgment and courage in battle, while commoners reserved their consumption for religious ceremonies and coming-of-age rites. Beyond the palace, cacao beans formed the backbone of the Aztec economy. In bustling Tlatelolco market squares, merchants displayed rows of gleaming beans alongside colourful textiles and obsidian tools. A standard tribute required of subject provinces was paid in cacao. Thousands of beans delivered each harvest season to uphold vassal loyalty. Failure to remit the proper tribute was tantamount to rebellion, for cacao was, in effect, the currency of empire. The military also relied on cacao's perceived vigour. Warriors received allotments of beans before setting out on campaigns, confident that the drink's stimulating properties would sharpen their senses in the throes of combat. Conquistadors noted that Aztec soldiers drank cacao like water, their ritual mugs clutched in gauntleted hands as they hurled spear or javelin with unerring precision. There were even specialized chocolate barracks, where elite jaguar and eagle warrior societies convened to train, their walls lined with murals depicting cacao ceremonies and battlefield triumphs. But cacao's importance transcended economics and warfare. It was woven into the very fabric of Aztec spirituality. During the festival of Huitozozli, dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god, priests prepared xocoatl as a sacred offering. They ladled the frothy beverage into earthenware bowls and presented them on temple steps, believing that each cup called forth the rains that would nourish their maize fields. In the new fire ceremony, held every 50 years to renew the sun's warmth in the cosmos, cacao was among the essential ingredients in the ritual feast that sealed the pact between gods and mortals. Records tell of a particularly lavish ceremony in 1504, when Montezuma III's ancestor to Montezuma II received envoys from distant Mixtec lords. To honor the foreign dignitaries, the Aztecs constructed an elaborate pavilion draped in banners dyed with cochineal red, and served a succession of xochotl brews, each spiced differently to represent the cardinal directions. The guests marveled at the display, interpreting the variety of flavors as a testament to the Aztecs' mastery over both nature and ceremony. Yet not all cacao was equal. The finest beans came from groves near the Gulf Coast, where humid air and rich volcanic soils produced pods of exceptional size and flavor. The emperor claimed exclusive rights to these premium beans, while lesser varieties were reserved for the nobility and tribute payments. Commoners often relied on wild-growing trees in the highlands, where pods were smaller and the resulting brew more astringent. Even then, owning a handful of beans was a mark of status, so much so that thieves who stole cacao from royal granaries faced the severest punishments, equated to treason. When Hernán Cortés and his Spanish companions arrived in 1519, they encountered this world of cacao worship firsthand. Cortés was intrigued by the Aztec obsession with the bitter brew and quickly realized its potential for profit. Although his first sips left him pouting at the unfamiliar taste, he dispatched messages back to Spain praising cacao's versatility. By replacing chili with cane sugar and cinnamon, the beverage could be transformed into a delicacy for European courts. Meanwhile, the indigenous peoples watched with a mix of fascination and foreboding as the conquerors adopted their sacred bean. Spanish friars condemned cacao's pagan associations, but colonial administrators recognized that tithes paid in beans were easier to transport than maize or textiles. Soon, encomenderos, holders of land grants, established vast cacao estates along the coasts, employing both indigenous labor and imported African slaves to meet the growing demand. Yet in the heartland of the empire, cacao's ceremonial significance endured. Secret gatherings persisted, where priests and laypeople clandestinely brewed xocoatl in moonlit kitchens, preserving the old rites behind embroidered drapes. The froth on each cup was poked and prodded as an act of devotion, a tactile reminder of the link between mortal life and divine sustenance. Back in Tenochtitlan, the last emperor's morning ritual stood as a poignant echo of a civilization on the brink. Montezuma II continued to summon his cocoa chalices even as Spanish galleons loomed on the horizon, their sails like ominous omens against the horizon. The cocoa's bittersweet aroma mingled with the scent of war drums and the clang of armor, a final testament to an empire whose heart was inexorably tied to the bean. Today, when we pour hot chocolate and watch the foam settle atop our mugs, we touch that ancient legacy. Every spicy note of cinnamon, every hint of vanilla, whispers of priests chanting to Quetzalcoatl, and emperors raising their goblets in ceremonial reverence. The bitter water of the Aztecs remains encoded in our palates, a reminder that behind every luxurious indulgence lies a story of power, ritual, and the enduring human quest to find the divine in the everyday. Tomorrow, we will trace how this sacred beverage crossed oceans and courts, transforming from a warrior's fuel into an aristocrat's indulgence, and how the techniques of Dutch chocolatiers and English industrialists would forever alter the fate of the food of the gods. Soft morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of the newly renamed Chapel of the Virgin Queen, casting kaleidoscopes of color onto the polished stone floor. In this hallowed space, Elizabeth II's legacy did not rest quietly in a tomb, but stirred like a living tide in the hearts of those she had inspired. Even after the final dirge had faded and the crowds had dispersed, her influence rippled through art, faith, and the very fabric of the realm she once ruled. Nearly every court painter of the age hastened to capture her likeness in oil and tempera. Studios in London and beyond were filled with canvases bearing her serene countenance, the soft curve of her jaw, the resolute arch of her brows, and above all, the indomitable light in her eyes, painted now with a gentle luminescence that seemed to glow from within. Patrons commissioned multiple posthumous portraits, insisting that each gallery and hall be graced by her image. Artists vied to depict her most iconic moments: the coronation under Westminster's vaulted arches, the triumphant return from defeating the Spanish Armada, but increasingly, they chose to focus on a subtler theme: Elizabeth as embodiment of endurance and grace. Across the city, theatre companies paid homage in drama and masque. The Globe and the Swan unveiled new plays that wove Elizabeth's virtues into allegorical narratives. In one masque, The Phoenix Reborn, the Queen appeared as a spectral monarch clad in feathers of gold and crimson, her character rising from ashes to guide the nation toward peace. Spectators gasped at the sight of elaborate stage machinery. Gilded clouds parted to reveal a miniature Whitehall, and dancers costumed as ravens scattered black rose petals at her feet. While these performances celebrated her reign, they also reflected the anxieties of a kingdom seeking continuity through art. If Elizabeth's spirit could guide the players on stage, could it also guide the nation through the uncertain years ahead? Songwriters and poets, too, composed tributes that elevated Elizabeth's memory into myth. Sonnets circulated in manuscript and print, each line extolling her as England's steadfast star and virtue's fairest mirror. Ballads were sung in taverns and market squares, lamentations of the British swan, whose final note had fallen silent. One verse asked, "Where now the beam of Albion's grace, whose voice once shook the world's embrace? In silent halls her memory lies, yet in our hearts her spirit flies." Even common folk took part in this outpouring of reverence. In small villages, black ribbons and handwritten broadsheets recalling her deeds were nailed to church doors. Schoolmasters read aloud accounts of her life in grammar schools, ensuring that each generation would learn the tale of the queen who had fostered music, exploration, and maritime might. Childhood games incorporated her name. A hopscotch board marked with the words "Virgin Queen" at the highest square, where children leapt in tribute. Pilgrimage became a quietly popular practice. At Westminster Abbey, parishioners knelt before Elizabeth's tomb, leaving tokens of their devotion: embroidered kerchiefs, pressed flowers, and even lockets containing a strand of her hair. Some travellers journeyed from as far as Cornwall or Kent, sleeping in makeshift shelters outside the Abbey gates, convinced that proximity to her final resting place could bring blessings. Stories spread of pilgrims experiencing visions, a gentle breeze that seemed to carry her voice, or tears of sympathy shed by damp stones at the base of her tomb. In the wake of her death, charitable works flourished in her name. Gentlemen and merchants endowed almshouses for widows and orphans, echoing Elizabeth's own concern for her subjects. In 1604, the Queen's Widows' Hall opened in Shoreditch, offering meals and shelter to women left destitute by war or illness. Gifted with an endowment by Sir Robert Cecil, the hall displayed a modest plaque bearing her emblem, a golden rose entwined with a phoenix. Similar institutions followed: schools for poor children in Bristol and Hull, and a Siren's Rest for aged musicians who had played in Elizabeth's court orchestra. Closer to the heart of government, political circles invoked her memory to shape policies. When King James IV sought to unite his diverse realms under the banner of a single church, Anglican bishops referenced Elizabeth's acts of uniformity, arguing that her moderation had preserved peace. In debates over overseas expansion, adventurers, like Sir Walter Raleigh, cited her patronage of privateering. They claimed that her willingness to challenge Spanish dominance still guided England's maritime ambitions. Every proclamation, from colonial charters to religious edicts, bore the subtle imprint of her pragmatism. Even heraldry felt her touch. Noble families petitioned the College of Arms to incorporate elements of Elizabeth's emblem, the Tudor, Rose and the Phoenix, into their own coats of arms, claiming a spiritual kinship with her legacy. Town councils of Dublin, Edinburgh, and Cardiff redesigned civic arms to include her cipher, asserting that her reign had illuminated the path to prosperity, even in distant provinces. As far afield as Newfoundland, English settlers carved her initials into rudimentary crosses, staking claims in her name on the New World's shores. Yet Elizabeth's most enduring legacy lay not in stone or parchment, but in the subtle shaping of national identity. She had championed English language and literature at a time when Latin still held sway in courts and universities. Under her patronage, writers like Shakespeare and Spenser crafted masterpieces that would define English letters for centuries. After her death, playwrights continued to write in the vernacular, confident that the language she had fostered was at once rich, expressive, and worthy of the stage. Maritime prowess, too, bore her imprint long after her passing. Shipbuilders invoked her example when designing ships for the East India Company, launched in 1600. The galleons that braved the Cape of Good Hope, the vessels that carried tobacco and sugar from Virginia, all traced lineage to the navy she had expanded to repel the Armada. Sailors spoke of Queen Bess's wind to describe favourable breezes, a whispered superstition that she guided English ships across the seas. But perhaps the most personal testament to Elizabeth's enduring spirit came from the women who followed her example. In an age when female authority was rare, ladies of the court and beyond began to assert themselves in charity, patronage, and estate management. Aristocratic women, inspired by the Queen's independence, held salons for political discussion. They sponsored embroidery workshops and literacy schools for girls. Portraits of noble women adopted Elizabethan dress and hairstyles, high ruffs, jeweled collars, as a statement of solidarity and shared lineage. In quiet corners of the realm, women of more modest station found strength in her story. Midwives used herbals dedicated to Her Majesty's gardens, teaching apprentices the same botanical knowledge that had informed Elizabeth's favourite remedies. Merchant widows managed estates with the keen eye of a monarch, balancing ledgers and corresponding with distant partners in a manner that reflected the Queen's aptitude for both commerce and governance. In every festival and fair, from York to Plymouth, Elizabeth's memory was invoked in pageants. A May Day procession in Oxford featured a costumed Queen Elizabeth, riding atop a float of decorated swans, while children recited verses celebrating her reign. In Exeter, on the anniversary of her death, February 24th, town criers delivered Queen's decrees that mixed humour and solemnity, reminding citizens of both her human foibles and her remarkable achievements. By the time 2 decades had passed, Elizabeth's reign had taken on the quality of legend. Bards performed epic poems in her honour. The first collected edition of state papers bore her name in gilded letters. Foreign observers marvelled. Even King Christian IV of Denmark sent an envoy to London to study the marvel of Elizabethan governance, noting that her portrait hung in libraries from Copenhagen to Amsterdam. As generations shifted and fashions changed, the echo of the Virgin Queen remained a steady refrain in England's national story. She had bridged the gap between medieval tradition and emerging modernity, guiding her realm through religious upheaval, threats of invasion, and the uncharted waters of globalization. Her legacy was not merely a set of accomplishments, but a living ethos, that a ruler, especially a woman, could wield authority with vision, grace, and unyielding resolve. And so, in the verdant cloisters of Westminster Abbey, where pilgrims still kneel before her tomb, Elizabeth I's spirit endures. The tapestries that drape the chapel walls depict her life in vivid scenes, a tapestry for each triumphant season: coronation, armada, armada's defeat, and final requiem. Candles burn day and night, their flames a silent testament to a queen who, even in death, kindles the flame of inspiration. Here, centuries later, we find not a fading memory, but a beacon, one that continues to guide the soul of a nation she helped forge. Did you know that long before chocolate became the sweet delight we savor today, those humble cocoa beans were prized as sacred currency, so valuable that a single bean could buy a tamale, and 100 could secure a fine textile or a well-made tool? As we leave behind the hushed corridors of Whitehall and the funeral rites at Westminster Abbey, it's time to journey southward into the steamy jungles and grand plazas of Mesoamerica, where the story of chocolate truly began. Picture yourself under a canopy of green, the air thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth. Sunlight filters through broad leaves, illuminating clusters of ribbed cacao pods that hang like oversized lanterns from ancient trees. The Maya and their predecessors believed these pods were gifts from the gods themselves, vessels of divine power waiting to be unlocked. Here, in this world of pyramids and palm-thatched temples, cacao was the food of the gods, integral to every ceremony, every market exchange, and every rite of passage. Long before the Aztecs built their towering capital of Tenochtitlan, the Olmec, often hailed as Mesoamerica's mother culture, had already established cacao as a form of currency. Imagine bustling marketplaces where women in vibrant hupils exchanged beans for pottery and salt. Children learned to count using cacao seeds as tokens, and merchants weighed out handfuls of beans on balance scales carved from obsidian. In this society, a true measure of wealth wasn't in gold or silver, but in the glossy sheen of each fermented seed. Fast forward a few centuries to the height of Maya civilization, where hieroglyphs etched into limestone stelae capture noble figures raising intricately carved beakers of frothy cacao drink. This wasn't the sweet, milky chocolate of modern cafes. It was thick, bitter, and often spiced with native chilies and floral essences. Yet each sip was a ritual act, a communion with ancestors, and a declaration of status. Priests poured cacao into stone vessels atop pyramid altars. Warriors drank it before battle to summon strength. Brides and grooms shared cups to seal their union in both earthly and supernatural realms. And then came the Aztecs, who elevated cacao to imperial heights. Emperor Montezuma II is said to have consumed dozens of goblets of Xocoatl, bitter water, each morning flavored with vanilla, annatto, and a fiery pinch of chili. For him, cacao was more than sustenance. It was a divine tonic that sharpened his mind and fortified his rule. Meanwhile, the beans themselves formed the backbone of the empire's tribute system, flowing from conquered provinces into the coffers of the palace. But of course, the story doesn't end in the jungles of the New World. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century, they encountered this sacred bean and saw its promise for glory and profit. Hernán Cortés carried back tales of chocolate's rich aroma and potent effects, and soon the courts of Madrid and Seville were buzzing with the new luxury. By adding cane sugar, cinnamon, and other old-world spices, Europeans transformed the bitter beverage into a decadent indulgence fit for royalty. In the upcoming chapters, we'll trace chocolate's remarkable evolution. How Dutch chocolatiers invented the Dutch process to unlock smoother texture and deeper colour. How industrial pioneers like Fry and Cadbury turned chocolate production into mass enterprise. And how modern artisans are now rediscovering the bean's ancient roots through single origin and direct trade movements. But before we cross the Atlantic, take a moment to imagine those first hands cracking open cacao pods under a rising sun, the sticky pulp giving way to countless seeds brimming with possibility. In that primal exchange between humans and nature, the story of chocolate was born, a tale of gods and emperors, of pilgrims and traders, and ultimately of how a simple bean would reshape diets, economies, and cultures on 2 continents. Now, with the memory of Elizabeth's reign still echoing in your mind, let us turn the page and step into a world where chocolate is not a confection, but a conduit to the divine. Welcome to Part 2, the epic odyssey of cacao, from Mesoamerica's sacred groves to Europe's gilded courts. and the secrets it holds as the food of the gods. Dawn's first light filters through the jungle canopy, painting the air in shifting greens and golds as the humid breath of Mesoamerica stirs awake. Beneath that living roof, ancient groves of cacao trees stand sentinel, their broad leaves dripping with dew and their ribbed pods hanging like lanterns carved by nature itself. Here, in this lush cradle of civilization, human hands first learned to coax hidden treasures from these verdant giants, seeds destined to become the world's most storied treat. Imagine an Olmec farmer, centuries before the Maya or Aztec empires, rose to power, stepping into a clearing where wild cacao grows with abandon. He selects the ripest pod, its surface flushed with crimson, and slices it open with a sharpened obsidian blade. Inside, clusters of soft white pulp cradling scores of seeds glisten in the morning light. Curiosity gives way to experimentation. He chews the sweet pulp, marveling as its sugars dance across his tongue, then swallows the bitter seeds, discovering a complex tingle that lingers long after the flesh is gone. Could this simple ritual mark the birth of a global obsession? By 1500 BCE, the Olmec had transformed that impulse into ritual and commerce. Archaeologists uncover ceramic chocolate vessels buried in tombs, evidence that cacao was more than mere food. It was currency of the sacred. A single bean might buy a humble tamale, while hundreds could secure a bolt of richly dyed cloth or a finely wrought jade pendant. In bustling market squares, women in embroidered loincloths and feathered headdresses bartered beans alongside salt, cotton textiles, and precious shells. Children played counting games with cacao seeds, learning arithmetic through the very tokens that bound their society. As the Maya civilization blossomed, cacao's role deepened into the realm of myth and ceremony. In the vaulted darkness of temple sanctuaries, priests ground fermented seeds on flat stones, blending them with water, chilies, and cornmeal to create a thick, frothy beverage. Imagine the hiss of steam rising from a hollowed gourd as the mixture is whisked with a carved wooden stirrer, each rotation coaxing a rich foam to the surface. Under flickering torchlight, masked dancers would raise these cups to the painted visage of their maize god, Anek, offering thanks for harvests and prayers for fertility. Was each sip not just nourishment, but an act of communion with unseen spirits? Maya codices, those rare bark paper books, record cacao's dual power as sustenance and symbol. One scene shows a warrior king, regally attired in jade and quetzal, feathers, raising a beaded cup of cacao before leading his troops into battle. The bitterness of the drink, they believed, steeled the heart and sharpened the senses. Another panel depicts a royal wedding feast where bride and groom share spiced chocolate, signifying their union as both earthly partners and divine counterparts. Through cacao, life's most sacred passages, birth, marriage, and death, were consecrated. Trade routes crisscrossed the region, carrying cacao from humid lowlands into mountain markets. Mayan merchants loaded long-distance canoes with pods, paddling down winding rivers to highland settlements. There, in stone plazas ringed by thatched huts, cacao was weighed on simple balance scales carved from limestone, its value carefully negotiated in hushed tones. Even after the pods were husked and beans fermented, the methods remained remarkably consistent across centuries. Sun-drying, roasting over open flames, winnowing away the husks, and grinding the nibs into a paste, so potent it seemed almost alive. Yet cacao was more than economics and ritual. It was medicine. Maya healers brewed warm chocolate infusions with herbs like yaupon holly and anise, prescribing them to soothe fevers, settle indigestion, and calm restless spirits. In childbirth, midwives offered sweet cacao drinks to laboring mothers, believing the mixture eased pain and welcomed new life. Each remedy tapped into a profound web of botanical knowledge, passed down through generations of curanderos, whose hands knew the secrets of countless jungle herbs. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, they encountered this verdant world steeped in cacao lore and marveled at its ubiquity. Hernan Cortés described Aztec nobles sipping bitter chocolate from golden goblets, their lips stained by the rich brew. Yet it was the Maya, and earlier the Olmec, who had perfected the art of cacao, transforming a wild bean into a revered elixir. Though the conquerors would carry cacao across oceans, they could not replicate the deep cultural resonance it held here, a bridge between mortal and divine, a marker of status and spirituality woven into every facet of Mesoamerican life. As those first European ships charted new courses, the ancient groves remained, cradling the legacy of indigenous ingenuity. Even today, descendants of Maya communities tend terraced cacao orchards much as their ancestors did, intercropping with plantains and shade trees, fermenting beans in wooden tubs, and crafting traditional stone metates for grinding. Each step honors centuries of ritual, resilience, and reverence for a bean that carried the weight of gods and kings alike. In this first chapter of Chocolate's Odyssey, we've glimpsed a world where cacao was currency, ceremony, and cure. We've heard the echo of Aztec feasts and Maya temple chants in every whispered count of seeds. Now, as the horizon shifts to European shores, imagine the tremor that would course through this ancient tradition when sugar, milk, and copper cauldrons emerged under gilded court ceilings. But before we cross the Atlantic, pause for a moment beneath that green canopy. Listen for the distant drumbeats of temple rituals and the soft crack of pods splitting open, and honor the humble bean's sacred beginnings. A hush falls over the palace gardens as dawn's first light spills through braided vines and flowering bougainvillea. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire, cacao reigns supreme as both currency and sacrament, binding every tier of society in its rich, ritualized economy. Picture a grand courtyard paved with obsidian and basalt, where soldiers, priests, nobles, and merchants converge each morning to partake in the emperor's most sacred custom, the brewing of Xocoatl, the bitter water that fuels an empire. Copper cauldrons hang from hooked iron beams above smouldering coals. Courtiers in plumed headdresses unload woven baskets heaped with ripe crimson cacao pods. Exemplary palace servants crack each pod open with polished obsidian blades, exposing rows of creamy white nibs nestled in glistening pulp. These beans have already undergone days of careful fermentation beneath banana leaves. The husks removed, the sugars mellowed into nuanced bitterness. Now they spill onto flat stone metates, awaiting the sculpted wooden molinillos that will coax their essence into frothy perfection. As the palace awakens, priests, vested in cloaks of dyed macaw feathers, chant invocations to Quetzalcoatl, the serpentine god credited with gifting cacao to humankind. With measured precision, a master brewer ladles hot water into a hollowed gourd containing ground cacao paste. Then comes the rhythmic whirl of the molinillo, a baton carved with jaguar motifs, twirled between cupped hands until a dense foam rises atop the dark liquid. Aromatic notes of native vanilla orchids and ground chilihua peppers swirl through the air, stirring anticipation among the assembled court. When Montezuma II, resplendent in a cloak of jaguar pelts and quetzal plumes, enters the chamber, he is met with hushed reverence. He settles onto a low ivory throne, and a young noble offers the first cup of Xocoatl. Before sipping, the emperor inclines his head, murmuring a prayer of gratitude to Tlaloc, god of rain, and to the ancestral spirits whose labor fertilized the cacao groves. As he raises the dark brew to his lips, his eyes gleam with the conviction that each drop fortifies his body, sharpens his mind, and reaffirms his divine right to rule. For Montezuma, Xocoatl is no mere delicacy, it is an imperial elixir. Chronicles suggest he consumed as many as 40 goblets each day, each measured to a precise standard to maintain ritual purity. The beverage's potent bitterness, balanced by the warmth of chili and the floral whisper of vanilla, was believed to heighten alertness in council meetings, embolden warriors on the battlefield, and lend clarity to decisions that shaped the fate of millions. Outside the emperor's chamber, the marketplace pulses with activity. Merchants display heaped piles of cacao beans alongside woven cotton cloth, obsidian blades, and sea salt harvested from Gulf Coast flats. Here, cacao functions as de facto currency. 20 beans might purchase a cloak. 10 could buy a loaf of maize bread. Provincial tributes arrive weekly, baskets brimming with beans from conquered territories, each delivery ensuring the empire's coffers remain abundant. Failure to remit the correct amount is tantamount to rebellion, for cacao signifies both wealth and obedience. In the military barracks, the link between cacao and valor is palpable. Before dawn, expeditions into enemy territory, elite jaguar and eagle warrior societies gather to share a communal cup of xocoatl. They believe its stimulating properties endow them with heightened reflexes and unwavering courage. Armor-clad, warriors grasp their wooden chalices, etched with the empire's twin serpents, and drink deeply, their breath mingling with the steam rising from the hot brew. Conquistadors later noted that Aztec soldiers consumed cacao as readily as water, attributing their endurance and precision in battle to its potent effects. Yet cacao's influence extends beyond economy and warfare. It permeates every festival and rite. During the annual Huitozozli ceremony honoring Tlaloc, massive earthenware vats of spiced xocoatl are offered at temple steps, inviting rain to nourish maize fields. In the new fire ceremony, held once every 50 years to renew cosmic balance, priests carry flasks of ceremonial cacao through torchlit processions, sprinkling droplets on sacrificial altars as a binding offering between gods and mortals. Even personal milestones hinge on cacao's symbolism. During coming-of-age rites, adolescents sip dark chocolate spiced with locally foraged herbs to mark their transition into adulthood. Cacao's prestige is mirrored in its graded varieties. The most esteemed beans hail from groves along the Veracruz coast, where the humid tropical climate and volcanic soils yield pods of exceptional size and flavor. These prime beans are reserved exclusively for royal consumption. Lesser varieties are allocated to nobles, while commoners harvest and consume the coarser highland beans. This hierarchical distribution underscores cacao's social cachet. Possessing even a small handful is a mark of status, and theft from royal granaries, known as cacao coffers, is punishable by the severest penalties. Colonial witnesses marveled at the centrality of cacao to Aztec life. Hernán Cortés, writing to his superiors in Spain, described how cacao beans formed the backbone of the tribute system and how the emperor's mourning ritual was inseparable from statecraft. He noted that the beans, transported in maize husk cords, served as a tangible measure of imperial power, flowing from the empire's farthest provinces into the capital's grand temples. Yet, even as Spanish ambitions loomed on the horizon, the Aztec cacao tradition endured in clandestine practices. Deep within palace kitchens, women, vested in patterned huipils, continued to brew ceremonial xocoatl behind draped curtains, preserving ancestral recipes in defiance of colonial edicts that decried pagan customs. The foam that crowned each cup became a silent symbol of resistance, a testament to a people's determination to cling to the sacred knowledge bequeathed by their forebears. By the time foreign ships cast their shadows on Lake Texcoco, the emperors' morning chalices stood as poignant reminders of an empire at its zenith. Those first encounters between conquistador and Aztec court would soon transform cacao's destiny, as sugar, milk, and copper cauldrons crossed the Atlantic. But in this era, chocolate was inseparable from imperial ceremony, its every step in production, from pod to cup, imbued with spiritual reverence and political gravitas. As the sun climbs higher and the palace corridors brighten, the frothy elixir flows on, an unbroken lineage stretching from tropical groves to the grand halls of Tenochtitlan. In tomorrow's chapter, we will follow cacao's voyage into European courts, how Spanish nobles reinvented the bitter brew with sugar and spices, how the Dutch refined its texture and color, and how innovators, from Fry to Cadbury, laid the foundations of the modern chocolate industry. For now, let the memory of those obsidian metate drums and chanting priests linger in your mind, a vivid testament to chocolate's regal origins in the Empire of the Sun. The moment cacao crossed the Atlantic, it sparked wonder and curiosity. in European courts. Imagine a spring morning in Seville, circa 1528, where sunlight glints off polished tile floors and the scent of orange blossoms drifts through open windows. In a dimly lit drawing room of a nobleman's palace, a silver tray arrives, bearing a trio of small footed cups filled with a dark, steaming liquid. Courtiers, dressed in silken doublets and ruffled collars, lean forward to inhale the aroma: wood smoke, roasted nuts, and a whisper of spice. This was chocolate's grand debut in Europe, and every sip felt like an adventure into the unknown. At first, the unfamiliar bitterness startled refined palates, but enterprising Spanish ladies and gentlemen discovered that adding cane sugar, already flowing into Spain from the New World, transformed the austere brew into a decadent treat. Some cups were sweetened further with a dusting of ground cinnamon imported from the Ottoman spice markets, while others carried faint notes of clove or nutmeg, the latest exotic imports reaching European ports. Chocolateros, specialist chocolatiers, emerged. In wealthy households, their wooden pestles and mortars kept under lock and key. These artisans guarded their recipes jealously, passing them down through generations as secret family treasures. Word of Spain's chocolate miracle spread swiftly. By mid-century, aristocrats in Paris and Vienna clamored for Spanish chocolatiers to travel north, bringing their prized cacao and sugar-laced concoctions to the courts of Francis I and Charles V. In the gilded salons of Versailles, ambassadors sipped chocolate from porcelain cups hand-painted with gold filigree, their murmured compliments echoing off frescoed walls. In Vienna, the Habsburg imperial household adopted chocolate as a morning ritual. So much so that court diaries note the emperor's breakfast table permanently stocked with cups of spiced chocolate, served alongside delicate rolls and fruit, preserves. As demand surged, merchants established direct trade routes from the Caribbean and Mexico to European ports. Cacao beans, once measured in bean-by-bean barter, were now shipped by the barrel load, jostling in the holds of galleons. Bound for Cadiz and Lisbon, sugar planters expanded their fields in the Canary Islands and Santo Domingo to keep pace, while African slaves laboured under brutal conditions to meet rising sugar quotas. Chocolate and sugar thus became entwined, two commodities whose fortunes shaped global commerce and left legacies that echo to this day. By the late 1600s, chocolate had shed much of its ceremonial mystique and taken on new forms. Street vendors in London's Covent Garden began selling hot chocolate at small wooden stands, precursors to coffee houses, where merchants and muses alike congregated to discuss politics, poetry, and the burgeoning science of taste. They called it chocolate shawd, and gossip spread that a morning cup sharpened the intellect far more than coffee or tea. Not everyone agreed. Some pamphleteers derided it as an indulgence that weakened the body, but its popularity could not be denied. Into this lively cultural ferment entered Dutch innovators. In 1824, Coenraad van Houten of Amsterdam patented a hydraulic press capable of extracting roughly half the fat from roasted cacao beans, yielding a fine, defatted cocoa powder and a byproduct, cocoa butter, that would revolutionize chocolate's texture. Van Houten's process, later refined with the addition of alkaline salts, Dutching, produced a smoother powder with milder flavor and richer color. Suddenly, home cooks could stir cocoa into milk or water with ease, and confectioners gained a versatile ingredient for cakes, ice creams, and molded sweets. Around the same time, chemists and chocolatiers began experimenting with blending back in some of that precious cocoa butter, crafting solid chocolate bars that melted luxuriously on the tongue. In 1847, the British firm J.S. Fry & Sons combined cocoa powder, sugar, and cocoa butter to create the first modern, eatable chocolate bar. A dense, bittersweet slab, meant for chewing rather than drinking. This innovation laid the groundwork for an explosion of new products. Chocolate creams, nut-studded bars, and truffles would soon follow. Just over a decade later, in 1866, another breakthrough emerged in Switzerland. Rodolphe Linn introduced the conching process, a prolonged mechanical stirring of liquid chocolate that smoothed out gritty particles and developed more nuanced flavors by distributing cocoa butter evenly. Chocolate that once felt coarse and chalky on the palate now flowed silkily. It was as if the bean itself had been unlocked, revealing depths of aroma and taste previously hidden. Lindt's invention set the standard for luxury chocolate and inspired confectioners across Europe to refine their techniques. Meanwhile, in 1875, Daniel Peter, a Swiss chocolatier, teamed up with Henri Nestlé, pioneer of condensed milk, to create the first successful milk chocolate by blending dairy solids into a finely ground chocolate mass and employing conching to perfect its texture. They produced a sweeter, creamier bar that captivated consumers young and old. Milk chocolate's popularity soared, and by the turn of the century, companies like Cadbury in England and Milka in Switzerland were distributing milky confections to markets across the globe. Back in the United States, Walter Baker and Company had been importing Dutch processed cocoa powder since the early 1800s, but it was Milton S. Hershey who truly democratized chocolate at the dawn of the 20th century. Launching the famed Hershey's milk chocolate bar in 1900, Hershey harnessed assembly line production and economies of scale to make chocolate affordable for the masses. His factory town in Pennsylvania became a model of industrial paternalism. Workers lived in company-owned homes and enjoyed parks and schools funded by Hershey's profits. The sweetest place on earth epitomized the transformation of chocolate from exotic luxury to everyday staple. These industrial milestones reshaped eating habits and social customs. Chocolate became a symbol of modernity, gifts wrapped in bright foil, boxed assortments exchanged on Valentine's Day, chocolate fountains at grand balls. During World War I, chocolate bars were included in soldiers' rations for their high energy content and long shelf life, cementing their reputation as a reliable source of comfort and sustenance. In the interwar period, advertising campaigns elevated chocolate to an almost mythic status, associating every bar with romance, health, or patriotic duty. Yet, industrial success bred new challenges. Monoculture plantations in West Africa and Latin America intensified ecological damage, while cocoa farmers struggled under volatile commodity prices, dictated by far-off stock exchanges. Ethical concerns arose over labor exploitation, even child labor, prompting early efforts at fair trade labeling in the 1980s. Meanwhile, artisan chocolatiers and craft movements began to react against mass-produced blandness, seeking to revive the bean's true character by championing single-origin chocolate and small-batch roasting. By the late 20th century, chocolate inhabited two parallel worlds, the ubiquitous candy bar and the rarefied realm of bean-to-bar craftsmanship. In Berlin cafes and Brooklyn boutiques, customers savored bars made from heirloom Criollo beans, each packet bearing tasting notes, floral, nutty, citrusy, more akin to wine than a childhood treat. These pioneers traced a direct line back to the ancient groves of Mesoamerica, arguing that true chocolate appreciation required respect for terroir, ethical sourcing, and the complex alchemy unlocked by careful fermentation and roasting. Today, the global chocolate market tops $100 billion annually, sustaining millions of farmers and a vast cadre of manufacturers. Yet echoes of its storied past persist in every bite. The bitter water of Aztec ceremonies, the powdered cocoa pressed in Amsterdam mills, the creamy bars mass-produced in Pennsylvania, each a chapter in a saga that spans continents and centuries. When you break off a piece of chocolate, you're not simply indulging a craving, you're tasting history, the triumphs of alchemists and artisans, the tragedies of exploitation, and the enduring human impulse to transform nature's gifts into something transcendent. In our next chapter, we will journey into the modern era, where chocolate grapples with new frontiers, bean genetics, sustainable farming, and perhaps most intriguingly, the role it plays in the art and science of sensory pleasure. But before we close this chapter, take a moment to savor the alchemy of those innovations, from Van Houten's press to Lindt's conch, and appreciate how each technological leap reshaped not just our palates, but the societies that fell under chocolate's spell. In the soft glow of a modern chocolatier's workshop, copper pots bubble gently over low flames as the scent of roasted cacao drifts through the air like a fragrant promise. Shelves lined with amber jars hold beans from remote corners of the globe: Madagascar's crisp, citrus-tinged Criollo, Ecuador's floral heirloom Nacional, and the earthy, fruity profiles of Ghanaian Forastero. Here, artisans measure each bean with the precision of a chemist and the reverence of a priest, mindful that every origin carries a story of soil, climate, and human hands. Welcome to the era of single-origin chocolate, where each bar is a curated journey rather than a commodity. In recent decades, consumers have grown restless with mass-market uniformity. They long for the vivid contrasts that characterized chocolate's earliest days in Mesoamerican temples and European court salons. What if a bar could evoke the bright tang of tropical fruit, the echo of smoke from open-fire roasts, or the deep warmth of freshly turned forest earth? Small batch producers answered this call by forging direct relationships with farmers, traveling over mountain passes to inspect fermentation pits and study drying racks. These partnerships guarantee fair prices and sustainable practices, ensuring that the farmers who nurture cacao trees receive their share of chocolate's rewards. Step into a bean-to-bar factory and you'll witness an almost ritualistic sequence: the careful roasting of beans in rotating drums until their skins crackle and aromas deepen, the gentle winnowing that separates husks from precious nibs, and the slow, mechanical grinding that transforms brittle kernels into velvety liquor. Conching vats, updated descendants of Lindt's 19th century invention, hum as they smooth texture and coax complex notes from cocoa butter. Each stage demands patience, hours, sometimes days, of mechanical kneading to reveal the bean's true character. No emulsifiers, no artificial flavors, just cacao, sugar, and perhaps a whisper of vanilla or sea salt left to shine. Artisanal bars are often stamped with tasting notes: blackcurrant and hibiscus, roasted almond and stone fruit, molasses and tobacco, guiding the palate like a sommelier's menu. Yet the sweetest reward lies in discovery: a slow melt on the tongue, a burst of unexpected acidity, a lingering finish of caramelized sugar or toasted grain. These sensory adventures harken back to Elizabethan banquets, when chocolate's novelty enchanted noble guests, and to Dutch-age parlours, where confections sparked conversation and connection. Beyond flavour, artisan makers champion environmental stewardship. They encourage agroforestry models in cacao regions, planting shade trees that preserve biodiversity, enrich soil health, and buffer small farm incomes against market volatility. Sustainability certifications, though imperfect, signal to conscientious buyers that their indulgence supports regenerative agriculture and ethical labour. For every wrapper unwrapped, a cacao tree stands preserved rather than cleared, a community uplifted rather than exploited. In parallel, the mainstream industry is awakening to similar responsibilities. Large companies invest in research on disease-resistant cacao hybrids, aiming to secure harvests threatened by climate change and fungal blights. Grants fund farmer training programs that teach pruning techniques, fermentation improvements, and post-harvest storage, practices that raise bean quality and farm resilience. Even robotics and AI are entering chocolate production. Vision systems that spot defective beans, climate-controlled fermenters that mimic ideal tropical conditions, and predictive analytics that forecast crop yields. Technology, once the domain of factories, now extends into the jungle groves, marrying tradition with innovation. Chocolate's cultural footprint continues to expand. In Tokyo, molecular gastronomists dab micro droplets of chocolate ganache onto tasting spoons, pairing, each with notes of yuzu, matcha, or wasabi to create cross-cultural harmonies. Brooklyn cafes serve pour-over hot chocolate, steeping ground cacao in filtered water like specialty coffee, while Barcelona's chocolate tapas scene juxtaposes bittersweet ganaches with local cheeses and cured hams. Festivals, From Zurich's Chocolate Week to Oaxaca's Mole and Chocolate Fair, draw thousands who celebrate chocolate's versatility as both sweet and savory, ancient and avant-garde. Philanthropists and health researchers also spotlight chocolate's potential beyond pleasure. Dark chocolate, rich in flavanols, is studied for cardiovascular benefits, cognitive support, and mood enhancement. Though tempered by cautions over sugar and fat, scientific papers reference centuries of traditional medicine, from Maya curanderos to 17th century European apothecaries, who prescribed cacao for everything from digestive woes to melancholy. Today's formulators extract pure cocoa polyphenols for supplements and functional foods, echoing a time when every cup of bitter water was both ritual and remedy. Meanwhile, social justice movements link chocolate to broader conversations about colonial legacies and equitable trade. Museums and universities curate exhibitions that trace cacao's journey alongside stories of indigenous ingenuity, colonial conquest, and modern globalization. Scholars amplify farmers' voices, documenting oral histories that reveal how communities adapted to shifting demands, from pre-Columbian barter systems to mercantile plantations to today's cooperative networks. These narratives challenge us to consider: who owns cacao's history? Who benefits from its bounty? And how can consumers participate in chocolate's next chapter with awareness and advocacy? Back in the kitchen, home enthusiasts join the Renaissance. Bean-to-bar kits and online workshops invite novices to roast and grind their own batches, transforming home counters into makeshift factories. YouTube channels demystify tempering methods, showcase creative fillings, passion fruit ganache, matcha, praline, sea salt caramel, and inspire a new generation to see chocolate as both craft and canvas. Weekend bakers fold chopped dark chocolate into sourdough pancakes or infuse hot cocoa bombs with lavender and chili, mixing tradition with personal flair. As the world's appetite for chocolate grows, projected to exceed 7 million metric tons annually, the imperative to balance pleasure with responsibility intensifies. From the shaded groves of West Africa to the sleek boutiques of Paris and New York, stakeholders wrestle with challenges: child labor, deforestation, price volatility, and climate shifts. Yet the same human spirit that coaxed the first Aztec froth from a gourd now fuels collaborations across sectors, governments, NGOs, corporations, and cooperatives, to ensure cacao's future remains as rich and resilient as its past. In the end, every bite of chocolate connects us to a lineage that spans sacred Mayan ceremonies, royal courts, revolutionary industrialization, and today's micro-batched masterpieces. It embodies our collective history, our quests for innovation, our struggles for justice, our relentless search for beauty and delight in the natural world. So the next time you pause to taste a shard of single-origin bar or share a fondue pot with friends, remember, you're not just savoring sugar and cocoa butter. You're partaking in an epic saga of human ingenuity, cultural exchange, and the enduring alchemy that turns a humble seed into something transcendent. And with that, our odyssey concludes. Yet the story of chocolate continues, written anew, with each harvest, each recipe, each moment of shared enjoyment. May your taste buds remain ever curious, and your heart ever open to the wonders tucked within every cacao bean.